And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the monastery, the open bar of the internet, the world's greatest shit show, and the place where we, the good brothers and sisters of this most holy of temples, seek enlightenment through the drunkest, craziest, and most batshit ways possible. I am your one and only gaming monk, better known as Mildra, and with me, I have a newcomer into the temple, creator of the quick and dirty RPG system, which we'll be going over tonight, the one and only Ronwise Gamgee. How you doing today, man?
Alright, it's Ronwise Gamgee. Yeah.
Gamgee.
After Samwise Gamgee.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah.
Thank
you for having me.
Yeah, I unfortunately have an accent. But one of the traditions around here, of course, is opening with the humble beginnings, in a sense. So, walk me through your first introduction to role-playing games and what made it stick.
Alright, my first introduction to role-playing games was when I was in 10th grade. This was back in 96 or so. And a friend of mine told me that his cousin had gifted him the Ravenloft box set for 2nd edition AD&D.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, "Oh, you wanted to try it out?" I'm like, "Yeah," and he was telling me stories about some of the adventures that his cousin had gone through, where the Lich Azalin had turned like one of the PCs into a chicken. And before that, I've heard of D&D prior, back when I was in middle school, but I was kind of put off hearing about how, like, as a wizard, you have D4 hit points, and you can roll 1 hit point at first level, and it's like 1 hit and you're dead. Like, that sucks. That doesn't interest me. But we got into creating characters, and we didn't really rock the rules all that much. So my first character was this half-elf fighter mage called Baron Lanchester. And his first character, he modeled him after a Ronin warrior, but his suit, or his battle armor suit, was like black and white.
Mm-hmm.
And we did this one encounter. I mean, even from the very beginning, he would always have GNPCs or DMPCs in the campaigns. And so we had one of our earliest encounters, we were fighting like 6 kobolds. And he described them like kind of like being in a line, and so he wanted to try just like doing a dash attack that would decapitate all 6 at a time. And we was like, "How do you do that?" I'm like, "I don't know." So he looked at his ability scores. He had an 18 in strength. It's like, okay, roll under strength. So he did that, and it happened. Like, wow, like, it's fucking awesome, And then, as we went about learning how to play AD&D 2nd edition, it became less awesome because, they had procedures for these kinds of things, and the choices they made for like their fundamentals, it really rubbed me the wrong way, such as armor class being attack avoidance, and just the way saving throws were set up, and the class is feeling really restricted. And we did multiple campaigns together over the phone, actually. We'd be bored, throughout the week, and I'll call up and I'll be like, "Hey man, like, you want to continue running our D&D campaign?" Like, "Yeah, sure." And you see, from that campaign, I've had my highest level character named Humphrey LaPont.
Mm-hmm.
He was a paladin, and he made it all the way to 15th level. In this one particular campaign, my DM, he pulled this pretty screwed up troll where, after defeating a green dragon, we went to like the treasure pile, and there was like plate armor and this really fancy sword. So, I picked up the sword, like, oh, the sword, and it was the Holy Avenger. And then, oh, the armor, it was like +3 plate. And oh, the ring. And it was a cursed ring where, as long as I had it on, the Holy Avenger, like any paladin-like features that would be conferred to me, were denied to me. And, we reached, like, we kind of had, like, kind of an argument regarding the consequences of cutting off my character's finger so he can get rid of the ring. And he's like, bro, if you do that, like, I'm going to lower your charisma down by 1. It's like, why? Charisma doesn't really have anything to do with, like, it's not really like an appearance thing. It's a force of personality thing.
Yeah, that's a common mistake. even the old AD&D book brought up that mistake. I think it was AD&D where it was either one of the basic versions or the like, but there was a paragraph that talked about how charisma doesn't necessarily equate to physical attractiveness. It can be a factor, but it's more about force of personality, and they used Napoleon Bonaparte as an example, since he wasn't exactly the prettiest guy in the room, but he was
a short king.
Yeah, but was definitely charismatic. Oh.
So even with my counter argument of, you can just wear a glove and nobody's really gonna notice it, he didn't budge. So I just said screw it, and just kept on until I reached the proper narrative moment of which I would lift the curse and unleash the full power of the Holy Avenger, along with like a special custom attack that was exclusive to my character. It was like a once a day thing where I would throw like a holy wave from my blade that would deal 5d12 damage, and I blew that ability like first thing in like the final fight, and I missed, of course, this being D&D. And at that time during that final fight, I was 5th level, and my arch nemesis, the anti-paladin Lycos, who, by his name, he was a werewolf. He was 15th level. And so, there's a 6 level disparity between us, and we were at the top of a tower. And the DM says, well, like, he's gonna like rush at you. And so, I put myself in the shoes of Humphrey LaPont, seeing this character who's like much stronger than I am, rushing at me, like to strike me down.
Mm-hmm.
And I told him, you know what? I want to make sure I'm at the edge of the tower, and then when he's close enough, stop, drop, and roll. And so, if I recall correctly, I think he made me do like a dexterity check, and he succeeded, and his foot slammed into my sternum, dealt some damage, but he toppled over and he fell off the tower. And I apparently got his experience point total, which brought me from 9th level to 15th level instantly. Like, fuck it,
Which, around that time, that pretty much cap you off, unless you're going with some of the more out there stuff, like Masters or Immortals.
I recall correctly, for 2nd edition, humans didn't have a level limit with regards to their class. It was the other races.
Yeah, it's. I may check later because with so many different editions and edits of the same edition, things can get cross-wired.
But yeah, we had to follow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The NPC. This. There's 2. Ravenloft sacrificed my Holy Avenger.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't mind. It seemed like a very in character thing to do. so I wasn't miffed about that. So yeah, that's pretty much my origins of getting into tabletop role-playing games.
Mm-hmm. So to follow up on that, it definitely seems, especially with Quick and Dirty, that you've experimented with a bunch of different systems. What prompted the creation of the Quick and Dirty RPG system? Was it just wanting something that hit the notes of what you were looking for, and nothing else was making the cut, or something like that?
Pretty much. There's a lot of a lot of features I like from other games, but just the whole fallacy of looking for the one true system. But I recognize that was that was an impossibility. So I'm more for something that'll be ideal for the way that I play and I run games, and also incorporating complaints that I've heard from either novices or people who they didn't really, that they were kind of put off with the hobby. Like I had this one friend where the reason she told me that she didn't really get into tabletop RPGs was it has all these numbers and stuff and all this math. It's the initial response is come on, it's not that bad. But then I figured, let me try to accommodate for that in order to make this game more palpable for the non-gamer, and which is kind of ironic since this is a super niche product of mine.
Yeah, and although if I'm being honest, I've heard the math remark plenty of times, and sometimes I wonder if it's a case of people imagining the amount of math that is required versus the amount that's actually there, or if anything, it's probably a case of people using that one game, the world's most litigious role-playing game, as a representative of the whole medium, which is understandable to a point, but I still have to call it out, because when I see people say, "Oh, I'm not good at math," I end up asking, "Can you do PEMDAS?" Yes, then you're good.
PEMDAS being "Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally"?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, there was an R in it when I was growing up, but that seems to have faded out. R for radicals, so it was PERMDAS, right, which is a little bit easier to say, but that's another story. I liken it to the monster under the bed or the monster in the closet. They seem fearsome and scary when we're kids, but then you open the closet and they're not. And it's one of those things where I can see where I look at it as just the consequence of misinformation. But that's another story. What would some of the games that you would consider part of the Appendix N of Quick and Dirty, in terms of other games that you may have drawn inspiration from or may have served a minor or major influence on the system?
Okay, well, for that, let's go to, I don't know if you have the document open.
I do.
But in case you do, go to page 138. My sources of inspiration. So I'll just read off the names of the games. Mm-hmm. There's more detail there for anyone who wants to go to DriveThruRPG and download this and pay what you want.
Yep.
So,
and for those watching on YouTube, the link for the DriveThruRPG page is going to be in the low bar.
Thank you. Okay, and as I go through these, if you want me to elaborate more on that, feel free to interrupt and why that or what about that maybe you wanted to put into it. Mm-hmm. So there's Apocalypse World, there's the Sentinel Comics RPG, Mythic Game Master Emulator, Iron Sworn,
Mm-hmm.
Fragged Empire, Fate Accelerated,
Mm-hmm.
Blades in the Dark, Crescendo of Violence,
Mm-hmm.
Hearts of Wulin, Burning Wheel,
Yep.
Worlds in Peril,
Mm-hmm.
the Bounty Hunter TTRPG,
Yep.
Quest, Dune Adventures in the Imperium,
Mm-hmm.
the Resistance Toolbox, City of Mist
Mm-hmm.
TTRPG, AD&D Second Edition, and Consent in Gaming, like that document.
Yeah.
Just to cover my bases with regards to that part of like the RPG, just like that part of like the social aspect of like
Mm-hmm.
playing with tabletop RPGs with people who they have different sensibilities or whatnot.
Yeah, and
And
some of
for those who are, I guess, like kind of bothered by it or whatever, just ignore it then.
yeah, and one of the big things that I'd like to kind of dive into is I can see the DNA of several of the ones you mentioned, but
Hmm.
I do find it interesting that you focused on die sizes.
Yes.
I'm guessing part of that was to simplify matters, but also to allow people a means of exploring the full gamut of shiny math rocks.
Yeah, except for the D20.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I can see that most games that try and use a wide range approach with die types don't use the D20, mostly because it's a massive jump from D12 to D20, as opposed to the incremental by 2 jumps with the other dice. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. For me, the die sizes, or the different dice shapes, it has that visual element of, okay, so this trait is better than that trait just by seeing, okay, this has more sides, so therefore my potential of getting a bigger number, is bigger. But with regards to why I set it up with those, like with those dice and with that 3 dice pool,
mm-hmm.
is because the dice resolution mechanic is most inspired by, though not completely a ripoff of, Sentinel Sentinel Comics RPG.
Mm-hmm. Which the Sentinel system has its own interesting evolution, because it started as a board and card game, then evolved into an RPG, which I often bring up when in context of say the folk who argue fourth edition would have been better served as a board or tactics game as opposed to an RPG. When you've got cases of games that jump from board game to RPG already, an upcoming example is going to be Gloomhaven.
Right.
Oh.
And probably one of the latest examples is Arkham Horror,
Mm-hmm.
which basically brought like the Mansions of Madness games and expansions into tabletop RPG format,
Mm-hmm.
but is still adamant about all the fiddly bits, like the chips and the tokens, and it's like, this is really necessary.
Mm-hmm.
But for that, I guess that's also its way of distinguishing itself from Call of Cthulhu,
Mm-hmm.
an older game but same universe.
Yeah. And in that vein, I think one of the other things that's interesting is, instead of just rolling one die and using that to check the result, or using a pool and going with that, you're rolling 3 dice and looking for the middle most of the time, or the highest or lowest, depending on whether the odds are in your favor or stacked against you.
Right. Which is derived from what's his freaking John Harper's Blades in the Dark, with regards to fictional positioning. So I guess that was just my way of saying the same thing, but in different words. Yeah, the die that you use to determine how to derive your result is based on your fictional position. Are things, iffy, 50-50 / risky, roll and pick the middle die. Are things obviously in your favor? Are you in an advantageous position? Pick the bigger die. Is it the opposite way? Then pick the lower die. However, I've expanded upon that in order to handle situations where you're massively overpowered or you're massively underpowered. With with two game mechanics here. So in the case where you're overpowered, the game mechanic that I included here, let me pull it up. Scrolling through here. Yeah, where you're overpowered is maximize. It's called maximize victory. So you're not rolling to see whether or not you accomplish your intent. You're going to accomplish your intent, but we're going to see just how badass you are at accomplishing your intent. And then with regards to mitigating losses, it's not so much to see if you're going to fail or not. You're going to fail, but we're going to roll to see how badly you fail. And that concept, I learned from Hearts of Wulin, which is a Powered by the Apocalypse game focused on Wulin romance novels and shows. But this was an alternative way of dealing with these issues of scale without just ever increasing or ever decreasing numbers. And then the final thing that ties all this together is the concept of scale. So with your recent video regarding Chronica Feudalis, how it had mentioned that the human range of attributes goes from D4 to D12, and that the D20 is the scale of the gods and things that are above human. And the example brought up was if you're racing a horse, the horse is going to roll a D20 on its dash. Well, in this case, that's when you'd do things either shifting the position from risky to you're desperate, or if it's even worse than that, shifting things from overcoming adversity to mitigating losses or maximizing victory. Or if it's even more ridiculous than all that, just declare what makes sense, And in a respect, one mental exercise that I think would be very useful for running quick and dirty is to think of when you have conversations with your friends about superhero fights. Who'd win, and then what you do is instead of rolling stats for them, you just kind of logically make your case, and then from there determine, who would win in what circumstances, even though the truth of the matter is the person who wins is the person that the comic book writer decides would win.
So, funny thing about that, speaking of comics, is when it comes to adapting comic book characters, there's always been the tricky moments of some characters who should have a statistic disadvantage but are still able to hold their own. And the example I often use is how just using raw numbers, a fight between Hulk and Spider-Man should be one-sided as hell. And yet if we see those two fighting in the comics, it's not that clear cut. And I look at that as a case of some genres shouldn't really be using static numbers like that, but should be a little bit more flexible. That's part of why I enjoyed the Cortex system.
Yeah, because it provides, lower tier characters more opportunities via the plot point generation mechanics. Mainly like whenever you roll a 1, you get a plot point, and some complication occurs, but then you can use that plot point in order to do things, above and beyond what you would normally be able to do.
The other thing is that Cortex has a horizontal and vertical approach to its die pool resolution. Because when you make that die pool, you're picking 3 dice, 2 for the result and 1 for the degree of effect.
Yeah, out of however big your dice pool actually is, and then there comes a point where either just adding more d6s onto it, like in the case of doing an AoE effect, will either just net you just like standard results. Like it's not really going to increase the range of how good your effort can be, but also in adding more dice, especially like the lower dice, you're just increasing the chances of creating like more complications, which is very in line with how a lot of comic book stories are told.
Pretty much, and
yeah,
it's one of those things that I think this is not an issue that I think Quick and Dirty is going to have, but it is one that I see with a lot of quote unquote universalist games where there are some genres that they're going to be more equipped to handle than others. Something like Savage Worlds doesn't necessarily have that problem because it makes itself very clear that it is skewing towards pulp style campaigns.
Yeah,
especially with that old tagline, "Fast, Furious, Fun." But trying to run certain genres and say GURPS is going to create some problems. And I'm not saying it can't be done, but you're going to have your work cut out for you.
Yeah, depending on, because the more comprehensive the scope, the more complicated or the more complex running it is going to be, unless you're like some GURPS master. But most people are not, and therefore you're just going to run a slower game, and ultimately the juice is not going to be worth the squeeze. And that was also like one of the overarching goals of how I designed this system. And I think I bring it up in my intro video that's available on the product page, where I just diss a bunch of other traditional games and whatnot.
Which I know some people are like, no, we shouldn't be dissing other games. I'm like, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all are cremated equal.
That's pretty good. Or in other words, fuck that.
Like I will talk. Some games deserve a roasting, and obviously some games have been my whipping boy for decades. Palladium being one of the big ones. A lot of people would think.
Which game? The late imp game?
Palladium. Just the
Palladium.
Just the Palladium line in general has been my whipping boy for over 20 years. Large for a lot of different reasons. Some of them more petty than others because I can be petty, but with that in mind, I do appreciate that when it came to things like character motivations and drives, you put in examples and went into detail on that, since that has been a pet peeve of mine with some narrativist games.
Yeah, that was really important for me to I guess to emphasize, because of like the open nature of character creation, which is part of the overall creation of just getting an adventure started, going from scratch. And with regards to how I design character creation with the more freeform approach, this came after, I guess, through, I guess, the evolution of my TTRPG journey, where, in the past, like, I was kind of like fixated on point buy systems, and especially like during the early 2000s, of kind of trying to quantify like what each feature in D&D 3E was worth, so to speak. But then Mutants and Masterminds came out. I was like, shit, this is kind of what I wanted to do, along with like a really nifty damage save system. And like that has its own tedium, because ultimately like point values are arbitrary, because any particular ability, any usefulness of any particular ability varies depending on the situation you're in. And so I guess obsessing over like, how much this is worth over something else, I mean, when it's within the same penumbra, so to speak, yeah, then it makes sense. Like 16 strength, it should be worth more than 12 strength. But for other things, like, like, should this 5d6 cannon blast be worth more than me being able to have a 50% chance to charm 3d6 people? Like, you really can't objectively measure that. It's going to be arbitrary depending on the situation. And so with this, I decided to say, fuck it, I'm not going to do it. Because I believe I heard this from Alexander Macris, where he said that each campaign is a law unto itself. Which makes sense. And so, that's why I decided to take the approach of, when it comes to determining like noteworthy traits, just have a conversation with the MC, the GM, whatever, about what you want your character to do, and you just work something out based on like how you want this, like how you want your character to play in this campaign. Because if you're gonna have a character that is like super duper man, the nature of the campaign is ultimately going to be different than if you just wanted to play like a competent normie.
Yeah, and that's even more something to consider when you're dealing with universalists, where you don't necessarily have a baseline. At least the baseline when it comes to the text within the rules, that baseline is something that's going to be put in by an individual table, since obviously characters in something like Torchbearer are going to have a lower baseline than characters in, say, a spy fiction game, where there's a inbuilt assumption that people are experts in their field, even at the start.
Yeah, and in Torchbearer, I'm glad that you brought that up. It has mechanics that are similar to the power scale mechanic that I included here, which for Torchbearer, they're divided into two aspects. One of them being might, which is basically like ultimately how physically powerful is your character, and the other being, I believe it was presence, basically like how good is your, like how powerful is your social status. So, with a Torchbearer, if you encounter like an opposition in combat, then the difference between your might and its might determines what you can ultimately do to that creature, or what you can get away with. If you can like overpower him, or if your mights are equal, if I recall correctly, then you can kill it, or you can potentially kill it. But if it's higher, then at most you can capture it, or if it's much higher, then at most, I don't know, you can tickle it or some shit. But there it's not using like, numbers go burr. It's just using like this comparative scale. And with Quick and Dirty, and even though on the character sheet that it has power scale, which generally measures basically physical dominance, you can like subdivide it into different kinds of power scales, such as like skills or like physical strength or whatever it is,
Yeah.
And then based on those differences in power scale, you can determine like which die result you use, the middle, the highest, or the lowest, or even if it's a matter of chance at all, as opposed to just kind of like a predetermined outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And then how do you handle that? You deal with things as they're presented in the fiction. You imagine yourself in that situation, and how could I deal with this dragon? Like, okay, I can't take it on by myself, so I'm going to get an army, or I'm going to get like a siege weapon to kind of scale the odd, to even up the odds. That gets players to think more in terms of, it gets them to be more immersed in the world, as opposed to thinking of this as an analog video game, which would be the case of D&D and Pathfinder.
Yeah. Or
and
I'm not sure if I'd use video game as the right term for this, but rather war game.
Yeah.
Since those were built off of the back of the wargaming scene and simulating squads or armies in conflict, which is something that's kind of been dialed back as you had more and more people come into the hobby who are more interested in TTRPGs but not interested in wargaming.
Right.
Which does rub some people the wrong way, because that's not how they got introduced. But as time goes on, people are going to get introduced in different ways. This is no different than any other medium.
Yeah, and different people want different things out of this hobby, where we're in a shared imagined space. Some people just use that as a pretense for doing builds and doing like the skirmish war game stuff, and others it's to immerse themselves in a world and I guess not get jarred out of that. And for others it's basically to see what happens next.
Yeah. And with that in mind, obviously one of the big things that people are going to notice when they look at Quick and Dirty is the fact that it's presented kind of like slides in a PowerPoint presentation. And I'm guessing that was a very deliberate choice on your end.
Yes, because I found the pseudo, I guess, academic style of like the D&D books just boring as hell to like read over.
Well, they were written by college history buffs.
Yeah.
So that, I think that's,
but even to this day,
like this is kind of further gone into in that Secrets of Blackmore documentary, but a lot of the early players were from like the college historian prompts.
Yeah.
But there's no reason that unless you're doing something specific in mind, there's no reason why the game made now has to have that same assumption, because most people assuming that everybody's going to be that same college historian is a bit of an ask. And if I'm being honest, some of the discussions among that crowd put me to sleep because of the fact that it feels like a bunch arguing about things that don't actually matter.
Yeah, and that's something that I'd find myself doing often years ago of running games. I mean, for the most part, mutants and masterminds, but just other games as well. Is what does this rule say? Oh, stop the game, look up the rules. That just destroys momentum, and honestly, that juice is not worth the squeeze.
Mm-hmm.
Better just make a spot rule, move on, and just appeal to logic, interpretation, precedent, that sort of thing.
And I am glad that you put in the MC part of the book, you put in the notion of quest starters and the setting profile.
Yeah, the quest starters I got from Ironsworn, and the setting profile that I got from Quests, which to me is leaps and bounds a much better intro RPG than D&D.
Yeah,
just hands down.
The big reason everybody's familiar with the meme of you all meet in a tavern.
Yeah,
and as funny as that is, as well as the whole murder hobo thing, I look at that as a consequence of a lack of guidance. And it's something that, as the TTRPG scene has evolved over the years, a lot more designers have put a lot more time into giving people a bit of a premise as what their characters are broadly supposed to be, and what their overall, some of the overall potential goals that they should have. It's a wide sandbox, but it's not an all-encompassing sandbox. I'll use, say, Shadowrun as an example. The player characters are always assumed to be Shadowrunners who are taking on jobs from a Mr. Johnson. Now, those jobs can take on a lot of forms, and there's a lot of and there's whole mission generators in the last couple editions to account for that. But there is still that assumption. In something like L5R, your characters are assumed to be samurai. In something like Dark Heresy, your characters are assumed to be acolytes of an Inquisitor, and doing the stuff that the Inquisitor can't be bothered with, or is the advanced warning note to let the Inquisitor know if things are really bad because everybody got wiped. In something like Necromunda, there's the assumption that your characters are associated with one of the many gangs in that. I was going to call Necromunda a hellhole of a hive city, but I feel like that would be quaint. That's like calling Mega City 1 a terrible place to live.
Might as well call it like a terrible country to live, because it's basically country-sized.
Yeah, it covers most of the East Coast. But having that sort of direction to put people in, instead of throwing them into the middle of the pool and saying swim, damn it.
Yeah.
Especially since when you're dealing with a more universal game, there is the elephant in the room that is choice paralysis, which is always going to be a thing to address no matter how simple you make a game, but you can minimize the problem with the right approach.
Great. Yeah, that's the advantage of RPGs, of tabletop RPGs, as opposed to like RPG systems, because the RPG, it typically comes with the setting, or at least an implied setting, so that provides like some direction, and that mix of universality to specificity, that can be done wrong. And I believe that D&D does that wrong, whereas you need to like specialize more so you can get that done more right. And by that I mean it's like the players know, okay, this is what I'm about, this is what this game is about. So like Monster of the Week, I think in that regard does better than D&D, because it's more focused. And like with Shadowrun, as you brought up, even though there have been supplements like, be part of a member of like Lone Star Police, or the what's the medic doc thing? The one where
Dock Wagon.
there we go. Or yeah, person working for Dock Wagon. And like those are cool because it allows players to go above and beyond the base assumptions, but while still keeping, this game, like the core of this game as, okay, this is what we're about. And I guess you can kind of do that with D&D by playing as monsters races, but it's kind of a shame that that's not pushed nearly as much as opposed to just having the base races go, hey, come along, like you could be just like us, that sort of thing. You can be heroes, like default heroes too. Like no.
Yeah, the funny thing about that when you brought up monstrous races is, well, for one, even though it's technically possible, the hurdles make it a bit untenable for people getting in. And also, I'm reminded of how Sword World kind of addressed this particular thing when it came to the introducing rules about the barbarous races. Now, I'm specifically referring to like the 2.0 era of Sword World, but it has the humanoid races and the barbarous races. Both of them are somewhat associated with the first and second Swords of Genesis in that setting. And that's one of the bigger things, is the fact that it actually has a setting.
Okay.
With its own approaches to everything. Like, there are some standard fantasy races, but they don't necessarily operate the same way as one might expect by default. Like, the elves are one of the big examples I utilize, because instead of just being immortal pretty boys or something like that, the elves in Sword World are a long-lived race, but more importantly, they're a race that's associated with water.
Interesting.
As opposed to the dwarves, who are associated with fire.
So who would be associated with Earth? Gnomes?
There are gnomes, but gnomes are one of the types of elemental fairies for the fairy tamer class.
Okay.
Like, as far as association with Earth, there's a few potential ones, but those are the big elemental focused ones, are elves and dwarves. Because there's a lot of different races, and a good amount of them aren't exactly analogous. Like I've seen, like, the grass runners might be analogous to halflings in other settings, but they have their own things that aren't really done in standard fantasy. Chief among them is that they can't generate magic. In fact, one of their big racial things is being able to interfere with magical effects, or just completely be unaffected by spells. They can get magic through items, but they don't have a MP pool themselves.
What comes to mind when you bring that up are the dwarves of Dragon Age, where they can't cast magic.
Mm-hmm.
But because they can't tap into magic, they also can't tap into the Fade, so they can't dream for all intents and purposes, which makes them immune to getting harassed by the Fade.
Yeah,
and
although
demons.
as was learned in Awakening, when a dwarf becomes a Grey Warden, they do get some first-hand experience about dreaming, and some of them can't take it as well.
I didn't play Awakening, so I wasn't aware of that, but Grey Wardening a dwarf is a good way to kind of do away with that racial quality.
I mean, they
like,
still can't.
You have magic.
Yeah, they still can't use magic, but because of that connection to Darkspawn, they can still somewhat dream, and in one case, he ended up treating it like like he was seeing a really, really bad trip of just ranting about stuff that made absolutely no sense. Then again, dreams aren't supposed to make sense, but the point still stands.
Yeah.
As far as Sword World races that might be associated with Earth, I mean, you could argue the Meria, which are more associated with plants than anything else. And the big thing about them is that they don't need to sleep. But that's a whole other thing. Now in playtesting Quick and Dirty, were there any mechanics or any concepts that you had experimented with putting in that for one reason or another didn't quite stick the way you wanted to and had to get cut?
I had to cut. So one of the things, or one of the incidents that occurred where the approximate way that I handled it didn't feel quite satisfying was I was playtesting with another person that was also making his own game. Trying to think of the name of it. It was Titans of Atlantis. So I basically created a scenario where it was using the world of his game, and in this particular scenario, he was up against basically like some gangsters or like mafia, but in Atlantis. And he was able to rally some people who they had gripes with this particular gang. And there's one incident where like he basically gave the signal to for snipers to come out and take out the leader. And so since the roles are player facing, I didn't want to handle that with just like a probability thing. So instead, I incorporated one of the approaches most suitable to that particular situation. Let me see the list here. One second. And I believe it was the clever approach. And then, his status was steady, so D8. And then with regards to the tool that he used, I think I used the plan as the tool. And, it was a good plan, so I gave that a D10. And then from there, he also expressed his intent as taking out the leader. And so, I determined that was like a risky thing based on like the plan and his setup. And so, he made the roll, and he rolled 6 or higher, and therefore, his plan kind of went off, as intended. So, now that I guess elaborate on how that went, that's not such a bad way of handling that sort of thing, of how to get a PC's intent when done through like other NPCs. And as another tool, you can also use, I guess, like the quality of the help. If they're not too shabby, you use a D8. But if they're like complete scrubs or people who are not like trained as assassins, use a D4. So, in a way, like since we're using this particular mechanic of approach and your well-being and the tool, there's a lot of flexibility in that. So sometimes it may be obvious, other times, you know, you may have to like extrapolate a bit, but it can work.
Mm-hmm.
Like this system, you know, it requires a lot of rulings, so to speak. And you know, I remember there was a video that I put out. It wasn't regarding Quick and Dirty, it was regarding another game system that I was working on at the time. And one of the commenters, they replied, "Oh, Quick and Dirty, more like slow and boring." And you know, they were referring to, I guess, the mechanics that I was explaining in the video that had nothing to do with Quick and Dirty.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, the reason that this game system is named Quick and Dirty is of more the nature of how I grabbed like this thing from this system, that thing from that system, and I put it together in a quick and dirty fashion, as opposed to like that it plays like in a quick and dirty fashion. And in a sense, it kind of does, because you know, like this is far from being like precise simulation,
Mm-hmm.
but you know, it's very good for narrative mechanics, and but still determining the outcome of things in a logically satisfying way.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the I guess in order to illustrate the points that I made, that's why I included, I believe it was like a 16-page example of play,
Mm-hmm.
which is basically a transcript, or it's basically like a game log of a 1-hour session that I ran for some other people on Discord. They were part of my FF14 group.
Yeah. What you ended up making in a kind of backdoor way is akin to a replay in a Japanese tabletop.
Yeah. So, with regards to, I mean, did that answer your question in a satisfactory manner, or?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it definitely did. And with that in mind, were there any cases of stuff that you had considered putting in, because of not wanting to make the book too big, you had skipped? Because that's another thing that can happen.
Yes. Not so much with regards to the size of the book, but with how it was going to play out practically at the table. One thing I wanted to put in before the setting profile was something akin to creating the world, like with Ironsworn and Starforged, where you would have different aspects of the setting, like, oh, it's history, and what's religion like, and what's magic like, and how are the defenses like. But putting it in a game system made that too broad, and trying to figure out like what kind of points of interest or what kind of details I would like to incorporate, I think it would have just taken too long, and that's why I switched over to the setting profile, which is very reminiscent of, or it's more than, it's pretty much like word for word from Quest.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for these kinds of things where, you know, I either ripped or heavily adapted into this document, I contacted these people just to make sure that I wasn't legally stepping on their toes.
Mm-hmm.
Probably the two I had to finagle with the most were with Green Ronin and with Son of Oak Studios.
Mm-hmm.
For the Son of Oak Studios, there was a situation that I wrote about with regards to how to handle like the searching for traps situation. And with like the Apocalypse style game mechanic, you really can't do like a roll to see like if you find traps like you could with more traditional games, like D&D, mainly because with Apocalypse World style games and player facing roles, there's nothing hidden in the background. Whereas, the DM, he can just roll in the background to see like he rolls a stealth check, and then like you really don't know whether or not your character like spotted a thing, or if he failed to spot a thing but it was actually there, or there was actually nothing to spot. And so there's an example that I found in City of Mist that handled that pretty well, and I kind of wanted to use something very similar to it, but they told me like, like switch things around more, because it would lead to infringement. And so that's what I did in order to better handle like how to handle the issue of spotting like an ambusher or whatnot. And the way that that's done is you make the roll and then you apply the result later on. So the player still doesn't know whether or not they successfully sussed out that there was no one there, as opposed to they didn't spot anyone there, without the need for making secret rolls.
Yeah.
Now, even though the MC doesn't make rolls in the traditional sense, like for like their NPCs, within the MC guide, there are still mechanisms for which they can use that require dice rolls, and it's mainly for content generation.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I can certainly get that. And with all that said, I'll be looking forward to seeing more out of the quick and dirty system as things go on. But I do want to sincerely thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come all the way to my temple and enjoy the madness that happens around here. And anytime you see fit to return, the door is always open. As I often say around here, drinking is not mandatory, but it is encouraged.
I appreciate it, man. I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to talk about this system, and just the pre-show conversation, just talking shop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do that a lot.
Yeah.
And of course, a sincere thanks goes out to everyone who took the time out of their schedule to come onto the show and enjoy the madness. And there will be plenty more where that came from, as there always is here on the open bar of the internet. But until then, on behalf of the good brothers present and not present, my name is Mildra. I am your gaming monk. Stay fucking frosty, everybody.
Take care and play to find out what happens.
moment for